Hello, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to tonight's event, Reviewing Washington, an assessment of the Trump administration's first year, hosted by the EugeneJ.McCarthy Center for Public Policy and Civic Engagement at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University. My name is Alexis Solheide, and I'm a sophomore at CSB SJU studying political science and Asian studies. I volunteer with the McCarthy Center, and it is my privilege tonight to introduce our panelists for this event. Our moderator tonight on the panel is Liz Fedor. Ms. Fedor is currently an editor at Twin Cities Business Magazine, and she previously covered politics and business for the Grand Forks Herald and the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. She was the 9th annual McCarthy Center resident in March of 2016, and she has participated in many talks and discussions with our campus community, so we are excited to welcome her back to campus for this event. Serving on our panel tonight is Dr. Louis Johnston. Dr. Johnston is a CSB SJU Professor of Economics. He previously held the Joseph P. Ferry Professorship and was an interim director of the McCarthy Center. Dr. Johnston has been an active participant in many McCarthy Center events, including our Politics in a Pint series, and we are very happy to have him here for another evening of discussion. Tonight, we would also like to welcome Congressman Tom Emmer. Congressman Emmer represents our district, the 6th District, in the United States Congress, and he has been an active supporter of both our campus community and the McCarthy Center throughout his time in office. He was the lead author on the congressional law naming the Collegeville United States Post Office after SJU grad and former U.S. Democratic Senator Eugene McCarthy. And he generously gives his time each year to our students participating in the Washington, D.C. internships, Brandel scholarships, and New York study tour programs. We are appreciative of his time and dedication to our campuses and to the McCarthy Center, and we want to welcome him back to campus and thank him for being here for this event. We at the McCarthy Center would again like to extend our thanks to our panelists and to all of you for being here for this event. We are excited to share with you in this evening of civic engagement and discussion. I will now turn things over to our moderator, Liz Fedor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexis, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening, people from the campus community and people from the larger community, and we have already had a breakthrough this evening. I asked the congressman whether he would like to make a speech, opening remarks, and I told him we have more than 40 questions already, and he is willing to forego a speech and to take my questions and your questions. And many of you in the audience have already filled out little cards where you have written questions, and so as I said, I already have probably more than 40, so I'm looking for common themes. The first half of the session, I'm going to ask questions to the congressman, and as Alexis said, we also have Louis Johnston, economics professor, and because many of these issues are economic in nature, I will turn to Louis for his thoughts, sometimes his amplification. And in terms of full disclosure, I've seen the two of them in action before. A few months ago, they were together on WCCO radio, but they only got 12 minutes of time, and I thought they definitely needed more. And as Congressman Emmer likes to refer to Louis as the professor, so this will be the congressman and the professor. And so the first question...
Or the student.
My first question is going to go to Congressman Emmer, and then I will ask Louis for his thoughts. During the first year of the Trump administration, the president's one big legislative accomplishment was passage of a tax bill that is designed to reduce taxes. But critics have said too many of the benefits go to wealthy individuals and corporations. Congressman Emmer, how do you explain your rationale for supporting the tax bill?
Well, it's a great question. First off, I disagree with the premise that the great bulk of it goes to anyone other than the middle class or the people that are trying to reach the middle class. When you look at some of the analysis that's been done by, for instance, CBS, very mainstream, middle-of-the-road news organization. You will see that they have talked about families at the $50,000 level, $75,000 level, $120,000 to $150,000 level. Every one of them is getting a tax cut of somewhere around $1,500 to $3,000. And it depends, again, on the number of children that you have. There are all kinds of benefits in this. But you asked the bigger question, which is why would you support this bill? Because ultimately, it's about getting the economy moving. And I don't mean at 1.8, 1.9%. I mean getting it moving at 3, 3.5%, 4%. Some might argue that it can never, again, get to 4 or 5%. Those people, I agree. If you believe it never can, it won't. But you got to do this. And if you go back in history, and this is what I did, and this is why I refer to Dr. Johnston. I always call you Lewis. Yeah. But I always refer to him as the professor because you study this all the time. And as a policymaker, we study it when we're looking at the different policies that are being presented. If you go back, everybody likes to wax poetic on our side of the aisle about the 1980s and the Reagan thing. What they ignore is Reagan couldn't have done it on his own. He had a partner in Tip O'Neill. Yep. What they also never talk about, because our side likes to be a little bit more critical of Ronald Reagan's predecessor, is that it was actually President Carter that started the deregulation phase.
Exactly.
A lot of people, they forget. So I think this has been a struggle forever between government and the citizens. You're trying to reach that balance. You can have too little regulation and you can have too much. I think you saw it in the 70s, and we're seeing it again now, that government has grown to such a size and scope that it actually acts as a wet blanket on the economic engine of our country. Now, you saw it in the 80s. You saw that when the Reagan administration took office, they continued the deregulation that had begun under Carter. They not only did that, they passed, I think it was Kemp-Roth in 1981. Then you had the major tax overhaul in 1986. It took a few years before it started to move. But once the economy kicked in, I believe the figure is that from 83 to 88, economic growth in this country was an average of 4.6%.
Around there.
And from 88 to 2008, I think the average was somewhere around 3.6%. And obviously, from 08 until, the end of 16, it hovered at 2 or below. Right. I think December of 16, it was 1.8, 1.9, somewhere in there. Obviously, that jumped up last year. A lot of that was emotion, people excited, what's going to happen. I think the tax bill that we just passed is going to have a similar impact to what we saw in 1986 and after. And this is what I put to the professor, is there's a lot of argument let's take the politics away, us and them, right? Let's just talk about there are people who have a difference of opinion. Everybody wants to get to the same place. We want to see an economy that's booming. We want to have the resources to pay down the deficit, to balance the budget, do the things that actually happened after Reagan, under Clinton, and after Bush, right? Because we balanced the budget and effectively paid off the deficit by the time President Clinton was managing it. So what do we need to see to have that happen? The three pieces that occurred, again, over the Carter administration, the Reagan administration, and then continued on after that before those that were in office started acting again and creating more of this regulatory burden. One, you reduced the regulatory burden. Two, you lowered the overall tax rates, albeit they were temporary, right? Because they creep back up. And three, it was about the monetary policy, right?
Right.
And you're going to be much better at this than me, because I think that's our next greatest challenge is the monetary policy. We've gone from creating wealth, when a society builds wealth, expands the pie, it raises the boat for everyone in society. We've gone, I believe, to a society and, quite frankly, a world where we are creating debt. And the only people that can play in a world that you create debt are the people that have the money. Because you got to be big to participate. And if you're not big enough, you either get absorbed into those that are big or you get pushed down to the bottom and you actually create this bigger gap. I think I supported the tax bill because I believe it's going to have the same impact in generating economic activity and growth. But then I think we've got another challenge ahead of us in trying to make sure that you got to have a monetary policy that's actually in line with creating wealth so that everybody benefits.
Louis, what are your overarching views of this tax bill?
Okay. I was going to wonder, where do we want to zero in here?
Sorry, I gave you a lot.
No, that's all right. That's the whole idea. We want to talk. My overarching point of view on the tax bill is that I was very disappointed that it was more on the tax cut than on tax reform. And you mentioned 81 and 86. So 81 was basically a tax cut. But then back in 1982, they had to come back again and raise a lot of taxes because it created a very large budget deficit. So in 1986, they actually did the fundamental tax reform, which took quite a while. It started working in 1983. People started talking about it. It took almost 3 years to plan it. And that's what I was hoping was going to happen this time, was that we were really going to go into the tax code and do things like simplification, do things like treating the same sources of income the same way in the tax code, rather than having the one thing labeled as pass-through and another labeled as wages, yet tax them differently. That really frustrated me a lot. But this bill's is a very mixed bag. And you're talking about how it's going to spur growth and stuff. I was thinking about this a lot. I don't think it's either the second coming or the coming of hell. It's going to help a little bit here. It's going to hurt a little bit there. But overall, I don't think it's really going to make that much difference. It's more going to, rather than the tide lifting all the boats, it's going to move some of the boats around on the surface of the lake. But I don't think it's going to change the depth of it very much.
Well, I couldn't disagree with you more. And I'll tell you, a lot of people go back to this 1981 Kemp-Roth Act, and they cite that in 82 they had to raise taxes. They didn't raise taxes. If you go back, what they did was 1981, Kemp-Roth is a tax cut.
Cut the rates.
What they were afraid of, Congress was afraid, because all of a sudden the revenues coming into government dropped.
Right.
Okay?
Because it was a recession.
Somewhere around 7%, whatever it was. And so they were worried that they weren't going to have enough revenue to sustain even the basic necessities that government is providing. What they did in 1982 is it wasn't a tax increase. They passed legislation that took away some of the cuts that they were going to put in place.
Right.
So they were already there. Now, here's the key.
Yeah.
Over the next 3 years under Kemp-Roth, the taxpayers still received 370. So let's go back.
They had lower rates than they otherwise would have had.
But here's what the deal was. Kemp-Roth, they took away $38 billion of the tax cut in 1982. Over the next 3 years, under what remained in Kemp-Roth, the taxpayers still received over $370 billion in tax cuts. Right. More importantly, that 7 to 9% dip in revenues that took place at the beginning of the Reagan administration, incorrectly because of they were coming out of a recession, and because they were trying to do a different type of stimulant, right? By the end of, I looked this up today, by the end of Reagan's term, when he left office, revenues to the federal government were actually up over 19% over what they were the day he was inaugurated.
Right.
Now,
over eight years.
Yeah, and you are correct. We really wish, when it came to simplification, we could have done a lot more than we did. But you have to admit, we did do a ton of reform. When you talk about streamlining it so that you can literally look at your taxes now, you've got, let's say you're a young couple, you just started out, you're earning $50,000 to $100,000 a year as a couple. Now, instead of trying to figure out all the itemization, we have doubled the standard deduction.
Right, which I think was a really good idea.
But it's simplification. Again, I wish it could have gone a lot farther. But this is, that's why when people talk about, well, you gave it all to corporations. No, really, to me, corporate taxes, that's not real. everybody here is paying the corporate tax. Ultimately, it gets factored into the cost of goods and services. So at the end of the day, we're paying it. What we're doing is we reduce it so we're competitive. We also make sure that we're not taxing people double so they can compete.
This is what you and I talked about on WCCO when you were talking, that Liz mentioned, which is, if you were really going to go for tax reform, I think I caught your ear on this, was I would suggest that we eliminate the corporate income tax entirely, because then you don't have that double counting problem. But where I think
that's right.
Where we maybe disagree is then what should the personal income tax look like?
No.
And I would argue that you should have a pretty progressive income tax and then tax everything through that, whether it's earned from capital, earned from labor. It doesn't matter. You just have one schedule that's very simple, and then everything runs through.
And so
but you're the ringmaster.
Yeah,
truth be told, Louis, and you're right, you did catch my ear, and it's a great debate to have. I like a flat tax. For other reasons, in figuring out where you set that flat tax rate so that everybody has skin in the game. But
that's why I invited you.
But this wasn't what they were offering.
No,
so,
exactly.
Yeah.
the two of you have set the groundwork for my next question, and I actually even have an exhibit for you to look at if you want to.
Wow.
Last year, Bruce Bartlett, a former policy advisor to Ronald Reagan and a former aide to Republican Congressman Jack Kemp, wrote a commentary for the Washington Post. The headline over his commentary read, "I helped create the GOP tax myth. Trump is wrong. Tax cuts don't equal growth." Bartlett wrote, "I'm not sure how many Republicans even know anymore that Reagan raised taxes several times after 1981. His last budget showed that as of 1988, the aggregate cumulative revenue loss from the 1981 tax cut was $264 billion, and legislated tax increases brought about half of that back. Are the two of you concerned that this new tax law stands a good chance of widening the national debt?" And if you want to look at what Bartlett wrote, here's a copy. The congressman is already on his phone. I think he's looking up another exhibit.
Well, I can start if that's okay. I am concerned about that, but again, that's why I said it's not Armageddon, it's not nirvana. I think it's going to increase the debt somewhat. The headline number, I think, was $1.5 trillion for the bill, right? We had to keep it under that. If you're talking about already $20 trillion, $1 trillion doesn't, what's that old joke that Everett Dirksen said, a billion here, a billion there, pretty soon you're talking about real money. I know it's not that funny anymore, is it? But that's, I don't think that's much concern, frankly. I just don't think it's going to blow up the deficit. It's not going to pile on huge amounts of debt. What I'm more concerned about is, how's the economy going to react when we have the inevitable recession? Because there always are. Unfortunately, we can't predict them. I wish we could. We're no good at it. And I'm afraid that the way the tax system is now set up is that we're going to have much more revenue loss in a recession than we had under the old system. And so all of a sudden, we're going to find ourselves in much worse fiscal shape than we would have otherwise. And what that means is that there's going to be a temptation to do things like cut back on unemployment insurance or whatever needs to be done during a recession. So I frankly am not that worried about the debt. In fact, I'm not worried at all because of the tax bill. There are other reasons to worry. That's totally different. But the tax cut bill, I really don't think that's a problem.
So I would love to have a little time to read this. Whenever I hear people say under Reagan they raised all these taxes, those don't sound right at all. And this is why, because I looked at it today. 82, we just talked about that. You were talking roughly 37.5. You were talking roughly $40 billion.
Right.
84 raised some taxes on estates and distilled spirits, which was $18 billion.
That wasn't much.
85 was, and by the way, some of it's semantics, because I already said one person's giving back a potential cut. It's kind of like you cut my budget.
Right.
But that's because your projected budget was 10%. We gave you 3%.
Yep.
This is what Jeff Howe fights every day in Minnesota. So in the Minnesota legislature. So 85 was a 16-cent federal excise tax on a pack of cigarettes.
Yep.
So I disagree. I'd have to study Bartlett's stuff much closer. And I did notice that he says there's absolutely no evidence that the 86 tax cut resulted in growth in the economy. And I just gave you evidence that, and again, it's not this simple. You can't say a tax cut or tax whatever it is the only thing and that it's a direct correlation. I told you, from my standpoint, it's regulation. It's the making sure people have more of their own money and they have the flexibility to create opportunities, and it's a monetary policy. And there's also human behavioral factors.
There you go. Yep.
But here's the thing. If they started, recession aside, with a dip when the economy had come back, it didn't come back at the level it was before. It came back 19% higher in revenues.
Yep.
So, and when you talk about the debate in Congress, it was this. You had to call it a $1.5 trillion cost because government books tax cuts as expenses. So if we're giving you back $1, we get to put on our books that you just cost me $1. On the House side, you have this thing called dynamic scoring, which does look at these other factors. And again, it's modeling and all the rest.
It still comes to the same conclusion.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, we have another timely topic, both for you, Louis, as an economist, and for Congressman Emmer. In this morning's Wall Street Journal, the editorial board had an editorial with the headline, "Trump Starts His Trade War." In part, the editorial read, "Fresh from a government shutdown victory and with the U.S. economy on a roll, the president decided on Tuesday to kick off his long-promised war on imports and American consumers. He imposed a new 30% tariff on crystalline silicon photovoltaic cells and solar modules to benefit 2 bankrupt companies, and a new 20 to 50% tariff on washing machines to benefit Whirlpool Corporation. The tariffs will hurt many more companies and people, and that's before countries retaliate." So that is obviously the Wall Street editorial board, which has been supportive of the president on other issues. Which one of you would like to kick that off?
I did last time. You go ahead.
Yeah, no, I have no problem with it. I just saw a little bit of this, and these are two, if I'm not mistaken, these are the companies that produce solar panels. If I'm not mistaken, they're U.S. companies that are producing solar panels outside of the U.S. and bringing them back in. And here's the problem we had with the tax system that existed, is that smart people were able to create operations, foreign operations, where they could create the most income, realize the most return on their income, while dumping their expenses in the United States and taking the greatest deduction. This is what we were trying to cure. And frankly, when the president does that, I'm going to, without having a chance to study it, that's his concern, is that you are gaming the system to take advantage of profits outside of the U.S. while taking advantage of your losses or your tax benefits here in the U.S. I'm more disappointed in the fact that he said when the Trans-Pacific Partnership deal, he took it off the table because of 5,000-page multilateral agreement that people don't understand. I get that. But I expect him to go right back and start doing one-off trade agreements with these different countries.
Do one with Japan, do one with
It's
China,
incredibly important to our economy that these things get done, and I'm very disappointed that it's dragging. We're not getting there. NAFTA, on the other hand, it's very interesting. NAFTA, as was explained to me, has a provision that says every 5 years it's supposed to be reviewed and updated, and it was never done. We also have major issues with our dairy industry and how Canadian price supports are putting our producers at a disadvantage. So I would say the president is, without being able to see the details of why he's imposing these tariffs, we generally don't like them, but there's a reason why they're doing it, and that's the most I can give you right now. I'm not going to say it's right or it's wrong until I know, but I'm not 100% in agreement with what the administration's doing on trade.
I'm I'm really concerned about this. I don't know if I'd go so far as the Wall Street Journal did about it being a trade war, but I am concerned about the signal it sends. And you made up a really important point, which is the combination of pulling out of Trans-Pacific Partnership and not doing any more, and then now imposing tariffs that especially hit hard China. It's sending a signal about our trade relationship with China that it isn't a trade war, but it's maybe a shot across the bow or whatever metaphor you want to use. But I guess what I'm more concerned about is two other issues. So first of all, exactly what you talked about with the booking your loss, or booking your expenses here and all that kind of stuff could have been dealt with if, for example, we would have gone for a border adjustment tax or something like that. And to his credit, Speaker Ryan really pushed for that. He thought that was a good idea, and it got pulled out. And I was really disappointed to see that. I thought he should have stuck to his guns and gone that direction. It might have been a good way to go. The other thing is that with tariffs, you're favoring certain industries. And one of the things that I keep hearing a lot is we shouldn't be favoring certain industries over other. There should be a level playing field. Well, what putting tariffs on, especially solar panels, does is it basically tilts the field away from renewable energy and towards fossil fuels. And I don't think that's the way that we necessarily want to go. A better way, if you want to level the playing field, would be, okay, if you don't like subsidies, get rid of the subsidies on everything, and then let everything have a level playing field. But in a way, I think that this tariff on the solar panels especially is an indirect way of subsidizing fossil fuels, or at least not letting any subsidies go to solar or renewable energy. Is to offset all of that. The washers, that one really struck me, because you said, Liz, this is a whirlpool tariff. This is a tariff that basically benefits one company, and it's disturbing, especially because a lot of Chinese manufacturers have been building appliance factories, and South Korean companies like Samsung are building them in the United States to avoid this possibility. What kind of signal does it send to them about whether we want their business in our country? I think it sends a kind of lousy signal.
Well, here, in reverse order, very quickly, when you talk about that, and this is why I think we need more details, because I'll change it a little bit. We have one manufacturer, American manufacturer of TVs left. The way our system is set up right now, most people don't realize it is cheaper for our TV manufacturers to import component part. Let's see, it's cheaper for them to import a TV than it is to import component parts. So you wonder why they build factories on the other side of our southern border, because they import the component parts to Mexico. They assemble a full TV and then they bring it across the border. That is cheaper than if the American manufacturer imports the same parts to South Carolina, assembles the TV in South Carolina, and sells it in this country. Right. There's something wrong with that. So when I look at Whirlpool, again, I got to have more details, but if it's trying to level the playing field because we have been abused with some of these trade relationships, I don't know if a shot across the bow is politically correct today, but I think it is sending a message, because these discussions are ongoing about, look, we want you selling product in this country. We want you to have a fair and open opportunity to participate in our economy. But our producers deserve the same fair and open opportunity to participate in these other. I mean, if you think about it, Lewis.
But shouldn't it be? Shouldn't we also think about it as, do we want to benefit the people who are building washing machines or solar panels versus, say, you or me, who's going out and buying a washing machine, and now we have to pay 25 or 30% more?
Well, who said it was going to cost more? I mean, this is.
If we're putting tariffs on the imported products, it's going to have to.
I'm saying if the tariff is just sending the message, and we'll withdraw that the second we have an agreement and this works. That's why I say I got to have more.
So it's strategic.
Listen, the guy in the White House negotiates in an interesting way.
I can't even respond to that.
We'll get to Congressman Emmer's tweeting habits later on in the program.
I do not do that. But last thing is the border adjustment tax. It was a Speaker Ryan thing. There was a question, though, that we could not answer. And that is, what happens when you put a border adjustment tax in and the dollar spikes?
Right. That was an issue.
Paul's answer, he's a professor. He sits at the table with about 6 of us one night. He takes a legal pad. He goes, all right, now look.
I'll explain this to you.
This is the Atlantic Ocean, and this bottle of wine comes from France, and this one from California. And by the time you're done, you say to him, okay, that's all fine and good. And if it worked that way, it'd be great. But what do you do when the dollar spikes, and how do you guarantee it won't spike? Because what you did with all your competitors around the world, and Paul is great. His answer was, it's a mathematical formula, it'll be fine. Well, we predict the weather based on mathematical formulas.
And the stock market.
Well, and nothing's ever certain. So, again, I don't want to be overly critical. Anybody here can. I don't like tariffs. It's not the right way to do business. But when you have others that are taking advantage of the system, I don't know how you get it. And plus, the World Trade Organization, these other entities that are supposed to be resolving these, they're dragging on and on and on, and we aren't getting to where we need to be. That's the argument.
For my next topic, I'd like to start out with Congressman Emmer, and then, Lewis, I will have a follow-up question for you on the same topic. Okay. We're here this evening on a college women's campus at a time when women across the country have been coming forward and sharing their stories of sexual harassment. In the past week, we had another member of Congress, this time Republican Representative Patrick Meehan of Pennsylvania, who was serving on the House Ethics Committee, and he was in charge of looking into the issue of sexual harassment. Yet it was reported in the last week that he had settled a claim of harassment with a young female staffer who I heard on the way driving here that he considered his soulmate. The claim was funded with taxpayer dollars, and as I said, this recently came to public light. So to Congressman Emmer, what do you think Congress needs to do to address culture change? Because this certainly is not the first case that has surfaced. And what do you think needs to happen to get members to behave appropriately in a professional workplace setting?
So first, I have to start it with, I don't like the context that it was set up with. Pat Meehan has denied whatever these allegations are. He has sat down with the leadership in the House and others. Pat Meehan has stepped away from the Ethics Committee and asked. People have to understand how this works, and this is the danger here. First off, when there is an allegation, as I understand it, in Congress, can be the Senate or the House. When there's an allegation, the member is no longer involved. This entity that was created and the lawyers that are in the entity take over the claim and start to negotiate with the victim and their lawyers. Ultimately, the member doesn't even say yes or no to a settlement.
Do you think tax dollars should pay for a settlement regardless of what the member's role is?
No, not at all. But you got to let me finish, if you would, because on this one, it's very interesting. Pat Meehan, unlike the other ones, which there's a handful on both sides of the aisle, these folks left immediately. They announced they were gone, and they should have. They should have been gone. In this case, what he's done, because these are all done under confidentiality, is he's asked the other side if they will lift the confidentiality agreement so that everybody can see what's in it. So just for that, it's tough because in the world that we're in right now, you're guilty before innocent. And I want to make sure that every victim has the opportunity to get the redress, and the consequences should be severe. But by the same token, there is due process in this country, and you got to make sure that, okay, we're going to give that person that's on the other side at least the opportunity to defend themselves if they believe they have that right. No, taxpayer money should not be used. And how do we do it? I mean, I guess I was always raised that you know the difference between right and wrong. Whether you're a person holding an election certificate, or you're working for a major news network, or you're doing work out in Hollywood, wherever you are, there's a behavior that is simply not to be tolerated. It's not appropriate, and it's stunning to me, the stuff that has come out. And I will tell you, as a father of a daughter who is reaching an age where she's going to be out working in a professional capacity in a career that is it has had some challenges. I'm really glad we're having this discussion. I'm really I'm sad for the people who have gone through it, and I'm really happy that we're actually addressing this today in a very public and painful manner. And I think the result is going to be good.
Follow-up for you, Louis. You've been teaching female students for years on the St. Ben's and St. John's campuses. How does sexual harassment affect their ability to have the kinds of professional careers that men do in economics and other professional fields?
Well, boy, how much time do we have?
2 minutes.
2 minutes. I thought you were going to say 30 seconds. No, it affects it deeply. So let me give you a concrete example. One of the things that my profession, economics, is going through right now is we're having our own Me Too movement. It was reported in the New York Times about how conferences, the way we hire, all have too much of an air of an old boys club, of if not outright harassment, of an intolerant atmosphere, of I'm trying to search for the right words, but let me give you a concrete example. The way that economists hire each other is we have this gigantic conference and we all have one market, because we love markets in economics. So we all meet in one place. So a few weeks ago we met in Philadelphia. Literally thousands of economists descend on a city and then go around looking for a job. And most of the job meetings are held in hotel rooms. Now, that is, to me, an inappropriate setting. You should not be doing that. So, for example, St. John's, St. Ben's, we rent a table in a large ballroom with a lot of other places, and we have our meetings in a professional setting. But there are a lot of schools who, they just say, all right, come on in. You got dirty laundry and all kinds of stuff sitting around. It's just wrong, and it sends a signal. As I said, it's not outright harassment, hostility. That's the word I'm saying. It sends a hostile workplace signal, and finally our profession is doing something about it. A lot of us have actually signed petitions and pushed for the spheres to have a code of professional conduct for economists that has a section about hiring that says, here's the environment in which we're going to do our hiring. And every step of it's going to be, as you said, it's professional. It's a way that we were brought up to act.
Yeah.
Just a brief follow-up question, this coming from the audience, this to Congressman Emmer. The person says, please define your term victim when you speak about sexual harassment in Congress. I'm not sure if this is getting at the continuum of behavior, because it obviously can range from an inappropriate comment all the way to sexual assault. And I think that is part of the challenge that the country has been having in terms of how do you define what punishment is appropriate and also address your issue of due process. But I think this person is saying, how do you define victim in this context within Congress?
Well, I mean, it would. So in my office, it's interesting because we're handling with Senator Klobuchar the Abby Honold case, trying to get more a certain type of training for our law enforcement and others, because when people go through a trauma, they tend to part of the brain doesn't do its job, and if you don't have the right training on how to do an interview, you can actually exacerbate the problem. And someone who's been the victim of a serious trauma may not be able to recall under those circumstances facts that are going to be important to the ultimate prosecution of the perpetrator. So in my office, I suppose victim, which is not where we tend to focus, but I guess the question is that. I would say it's anybody who feels that they've been threatened, anybody who feels they're in a situation where someone has used their position of authority to put that individual in a place that is compromising. That's my belief. And I mean, we try to, in my office, the door's open, or you always have 2 or 3 people in. It's more a matter of comfort, right?
And professionalism.
Well, I think it is. Yeah. And I don't know that anybody ever taught us that, but the other thing that we're getting, because we realize a lot of human beings don't seem to understand these things, and so there's a whole bunch of training that's being put in place for people to understand, this is common sense, you would think, but people are going to have to go through the training and understand.
There are multiple questions from the audience on immigration. I'm going to ask a question that I have on immigration and then follow up with an audience question. We can start off with Congressman Emmer on this one. As we all saw, immigration was a big issue in the debate during the 3-day government shutdown. Republicans have said they will address policies affecting the Dreamers, young people who came to the United States illegally as children. What policies do you support regarding the Dreamers, and secondarily, what are your thoughts about immigration policy overall? Because the 6th Congressional District clearly has become much more diverse in recent years.
Yeah, no, it's great. So first off, the debate that took place the last 4 days. It's tough because we in the House passed all 12 appropriations bills back in September. They were done. And you hear, it's very disingenuous for anybody on either side of the aisle to suggest, this is no way to run a railroad, these continuing resolutions, et cetera, Well, they're right. But part of the reason that they've been required is because we passed all 12 appropriations bills in September before the September 30th deadline. We sent them over to the Senate, and there they sit. Because Mitch McConnell can't get them across the floor. And people will say, Liz, well, Tom, your party has the House, the Senate, and the White House. Why can't you get this done? Because they have this inane, in my opinion, 60-vote rule for cloture in the Senate. And now you need 11 Democrats. You already needed, 9?
Yeah.
I think it was
51-49.
Yeah, but I mean, with the Alabama special and with McCain now probably not coming back, you need 11. That's been the case since September. And what's happened is, even though both sides, and this is not publicized at all, for whatever reason, have been negotiating on these immigration issues since September and before, primarily since September, because the president, when we came back from the Labor Day holiday, lifted the President Obama's order on the deferred action. And he said, which didn't get reported very well either, in my opinion, he said then, it's unconstitutional, I'm going to undo it, but Congress had better act, because if you don't, I'll take care of it.
It's 6 months.
Well,
I'm just agreeing. Yeah,
right,
yeah, that's what he said.
Then what happened in the meantime, in the interim, you also have a Ninth Circuit judge who has now said March 5th isn't even the date. Yeah. You can't do this. Now, I think his order is unconstitutional, but I don't put it past the administration to rely on that Ninth Circuit order and say, well, we can't do anything. We're going to just leave it for now.
That's why I didn't go to law school.
Well, but it's all political theater, unfortunately. But the point is the negotiation's been going on. For whatever reason, some people decided that they were going to try and use the appropriations process as the lever to deal with this immigration issue. It was a mistake. In fact, my colleague Colin Peterson from the 7th District said the exact same thing on NPR 2 days ago. They never should have put these two issues together. By the way, there were negotiations ongoing that Kevin McCarthy told us a week before this shutdown were actually progressing really well on a bipartisan basis with both Democrats in the Senate and Republicans and Democrats and Republicans in the House. And McCarthy was leading them from his office, Majority Leader's office in the House. This is going to happen. There's going to be a resolution of this issue. I don't think it's going to happen before February 8th. If you listen to what the agreement was, the commitment the other day, the continuing resolution is going to go through the 8th. In that time, they're going to work on some type of a solution like they have been, which doesn't get reported. If they don't have a resolution by February 8th, then what Mitch McConnell committed to do is start bringing up bills on the Senate floor. That's the way it's supposed to work. Yep. And he'll bring those bills on the Senate floor. On the House side, the infamous Freedom Caucus got the commitment to bring forward the Goodlatte Labrador bill, which is the Virginia chairman of the Judiciary Committee. Where do I stand on it? Look, the immigration laws in this country, first off, amnesty is not the solution. This is what was done back in the 80s, and all it did was reinforce what's wrong with the system. What the president is asking for is the border security, which, contrary to popular belief, both Republicans and Democrats agree on. They might not agree on the details, but the wall, for instance, oh, absolutely. The Democrats and the Republicans voted this in a bill back in 2009. All they didn't do was appropriate the money for it. And I'll get you the citation so you can see it. I will point out Dick Durbin was one of the very few that didn't vote for it. Chuck Schumer voted for it. Nancy Pelosi voted for it, on, and Republicans too. That's one. Two, ending, this is the pejorative, right? They use the chain migration, but it's about family reunification. Ending the lottery system and merit-based immigration. That's what the president has asked for, that he's trying to work through with the majority and the minority. Quite frankly, all of the issues that he's talking about come back to one issue. We got to somehow vet the people who are coming to this country, because we have to have them. We have 6 million open jobs right now. And if I'm right about the tax bill, we'll have even more, right? But we need people to fill those jobs. And so a country that was built by immigration needs immigration. The question is, you got to make sure that the people who are coming here to do the right things are the ones that are coming in. And that's what they're all wrestling with.
Lewis?
Just off the same question?
Sure.
Okay, just want to make sure. I think about immigration as an economic historian, because that's how I'm trained. And what I mean by that is I try to look at how immigration has evolved in the United States basically since 1790, if you will, when the Constitution, 1789, when the Constitution came in. And we've had what I think of as 3 phases of immigration in the United States. So basically from 1790 to the First World War, we had what today would be characterized as open borders. So I had someone say to me the other day, we didn't have open borders. You either had to come in through Ellis Island or you didn't get in. And it's like, well, my grandparents are from Warroad, Minnesota. You can just walk across the border, and there was a lot of that. And so that's, basically you could get in. But over that period of time, those restrictions did start to get tighter, and they were based on race. There's just no way around it. They were based on race. You created first restrictions on Chinese immigration, and then it broadened it to all of East Asia. And then in 1924, we passed a legislation that said what we would like to do as a country is we want to keep the same ethnic mix as we had in 1890. So we're going to create quotas based on what the population looked like in 1890. Thank you. And we're going to keep going with that. So that's the second period. We had a period of basically open borders that started to get restricted. And then from 1924 to 1965, we had a quota system that restricted the number of people who could come in total and then defined who those people were going to be. Then in 1965, we had a reform that changed things and basically opened the borders back up again in the sense that we no longer had quotas, but we still had restrictions. You had to pass certain tests and things like that to come in, and it made a primary principle this idea of family reunification. That if someone came to the United States, then if their family members also wanted to come here, that would be a priority. It's a long-winded answer to, in the current situation, I'm really concerned about changing to what's called a merit-based system, a Canadian or an Australian system, because it's really hard to know, just like any business person has a hard time knowing, what's the future going to look like? Who are the people I'm going to want? Someone who has technical skills today, who might rank really high on a merit-based system today, might not be the person who's really going to be important to our economy in 20 years. They might have some kind of people who have low skills, might have tremendous creativity it's going to be really important in 20 years. So using that kind of system to rank it, to me, requires a level of foresight, maybe even of ability to pick that human beings just don't have. And given that we're in Stearns County, which was created by chain migration for all practical purposes, and family unification, I think it's a system that's worked awfully well, and I would be really loath to change it. Stop it. No applause. I shouldn't do that.
One of the questions we received from an audience member referred to the Schumer shutdown and then said, are Democrats going to put citizens first over illegal immigrants? But the question also reminded me that to some degree, I think some individuals will lump quote unquote illegal immigrants with immigrants. And both of you brought up the need for immigrants in terms of filling jobs in the state. And recently I was taking a look at some of the demographic statistics, and I have a slide that I'm looking at from the Minnesota demographer, and this is based on U.S. Census Bureau data, and this is looking at 2011 to 2015 change in Minnesota's workforce. And the headline says, if not for populations of color and the foreign-born, the size of Minnesota's workforce would be declining. And so over this period, it shows that white U.S.-born workers actually declined 13,000 in Minnesota in that 2011 to 2015 period. And then meanwhile, U.S.-born people of color went up by 33,000 and foreign-born went up by 49,000. I just want to show this slide, this chart, to the two of you, and if either of you want to elaborate on that point, because both of you have heard the arguments where some people will say, well, these immigrants are taking jobs away from American citizens. Mm-hmm. And in some degree, white working class citizens, and to some degree, that was part of the debate in the presidential election. And looking at those statistics for Minnesota, I'm just wondering if either of you want to elaborate on that.
I'm wondering where the white U.S.-born workers are going.
Well, retirement is retirement is one of the factors, and then also people leaving the state is some of that.
This is the very uncomfortable conversation that we're having. We have affluent people from Minnesota that are leaving for other states, totally unrelated to this issue, but it is an economic decision primarily because they find better opportunities and warmer climates, and they're leaving. I mean, this used to be the magnet, right? How many families do you know that when you talk to them, they say, oh yeah, we were from North Dakota, we were from South Dakota, my family moved here, we were from eastern Wisconsin, my family moved here in the 30s and the 40s because this is where everything was happening, right? Why? I think the policies are a lot more than just the immigration thing we're talking about, which is why we should be asking a bigger question. It's not just immigration, but where is your population moving to? Where are they going and why?
Well, I think this has a really interesting, I'm glad you brought that up. That's a really interesting way to think about it. One of the things that I think really gotten mixed up in all of this debate is that Liz's question about our immigrants taking jobs varies so much depending on where you are in the United States. So, for example, I would recommend there's a wonderful program from the show called This American Life, where they went to northern Alabama and looked at the chicken processing industry. And the state in the late 40s, early 50s actually subsidized the building of these chicken processing plants to create jobs for people in those northern Alabama areas. And so what happened in the 1970s and 80s was the companies that owned those processing plants, they didn't want to pay the high wages for the local people, and they started encouraging and, in fact, importing workers. So the people in those areas were, I would say, rightfully mad. It's like, wait a second, we use tax dollars to build these, you're giving the jobs away. That isn't what's going on in Minnesota. And so it's, to me, a bit frustrating because we need different policies for different states, but we don't do immigration at the state level. We do it at the national level. So we've got to somehow come up with something that's going to work for your district, that's going to work for somebody else's district, and that's really difficult. That's really tough. But you brought up the thing about the white population. Part of that is just demographics. This is relative to where the population would be. So white families are not as big. The thing about interstate migration, though, yes, there are people leaving because of taxes, but for example, Minnesota gained population last year, and I don't think the connection between taxes and migration is very strong at all. The people who do demography and look at this stuff, they just can't find it in there.
I disagree totally. I mean, you look
Go
at
to Naples.
You look at New York.
We're going to have to get together again and have a session entirely on that topic.
Well, let's do it even more simple. If tax policy doesn't drive human behavior, then
No, that's not what I said.
Oh, okay. I should listen. It does.
It does not.
It absolutely does. There's a reason why LeBron James played basketball in Florida instead of New York.
It matters. Oh yeah, it absolutely matters. The question is how much.
No, that's true.
The question is how much, and so does Minnesota's income tax, for example, being a certain amount higher than it otherwise would be, drive a lot more people to Florida? I don't know, but
well, let me ask you this, because this was what we were wrestling with the elimination of state and local tax deductions.
Yes,
is we've still got 17 Fortune 500 companies that call Minnesota their home. They are trying to attract the best and the brightest, not only from all over the United States, but all over the world. These are smart people. These are people who are going to look at what the cultural offerings are. Is this a place that they want to live? But they also are going to look at the financial realities. It does drive human behavior because these companies are deathly afraid that if they look at Minnesota with 9.86 or whatever it is versus another state that doesn't have as high a...
And now they can't deduct it.
Right. It is a big deal.
Oh, it is a big deal. There's no question. But this was about migration.
Right. No, I got it. Sorry.
I'm now
I
going...
just love the debate.
I'm glad. We should keep doing it.
Yeah.
I'm now going to move to the topic of global warming and climate change, and it was the number one topic in terms of number of questions received. So part one is going to be part of an audience member question, and part two is going to be a question that I had prepared to ask. So this is part of an audience question, and this is to Congressman Emmer. You won't join a bipartisan caucus working to stop global warming, and you continue to support the use of oil and coal. Why should our young people have any faith in you to stop global warming? And then part two, part two is the question that I prepared, and this is, when President Trump decided to exit the Paris Climate Agreement, Minnesota-based Cargill, the world's largest privately held company, expressed extreme disappointment. The Cargill CEO, David McLennan, released the following statement, quote, "Exiting international accords like the Paris Agreement will negatively impact trade, economic vitality, the state of our environment, and relationships amongst the world community." So to Congressman Emmer, how do you view the climate change issue when even large businesses such as Cargill argue that it is an important issue that must be addressed?
Well, I think the president did the right thing by withdrawing from the Paris Accord. How many people have actually watched the speech? Okay, good.
I did.
Because what doesn't get reported is the president said he's more than willing to go back to the table and sit down. There are things that need to be addressed in that agreement. I agree with him. Let's go back and let's have that discussion. I also believe in an all-of-the-above energy policy. There's no question that we are evolving in terms of how we use energy in this country and in the world. But I don't believe you bite your nose off to spite your face. And I think in this case, we do an all of the above. In time, the marketplace is going to take care of this. It already is, because between wind and natural gas, very soon, the price point is going to be much better than fossil fuels. So, well, natural gas is fossil fuels, but in terms of oil and coal. So I think we're headed in the right direction.
Lewis?
I wasn't sure whether you had a separate one or not. Okay, so
Part two hasn't been done.
yeah, so I actually wish we hadn't pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord. Don't need to applaud for either.
Well, they're not applauding for me.
Well, that's not the idea. You're our guest. I want us to be at the table. That's my problem, is that once you leave the table, it's really tough to come back. And so the analogy I like to use is Great Britain voted to leave the European Union, and they seem to have the idea that they can pull out but then come back and have a seat at the table in Europe about how trade is done and all this kind of stuff. And their European partners are looking at them going, well, you left. You don't get to have a say. We're doing this now. And that's what I'm afraid about with the Paris Accord, is instead of staying in, and if we don't like things or if we don't agree with things, staying at the table and changing it, if we just pull out, the rest of the world will say, well, fine, we're just going to proceed in whatever way we need to. We're going to, if you're, for example, if you want to promote Wyoming coal or West Virginia coal, we're going to create laws that basically make it so that you can't export that stuff anywhere, and we're going to rely on coal from Germany and places like that. I'm just really concerned that we are actually, I got the metaphor on, cutting our nose off to spite our face. I'm worried that that's exactly what we're doing.
Yeah, we have an honest disagreement about that. I think that the deal that was negotiated was not very favorable, kind of like most of the deals that the United States has done over the last several decades. We fund it all, we give it all, and then we receive the short end of the stick at the end of the day. And I think I'll give you a perfect example in the Paris Accord. And it's okay. People disagree with me all the time. When it comes to the Paris Accord, we've got China, who allegedly every country gets to write their own plan. Mm-hmm. China's given themselves to 2030 to do whatever they want, and they can change that. Mm-hmm. The U.S. was 2025, and how much money is China putting in? Nothing like the United States is putting into this. So, again, this was a very bad deal in terms of the way it was negotiated, very lopsided. Look, people don't like the way this president negotiates, but it seems to work. I'm not always happy with it, but whoever would have thought that North Korea and South Korea would literally be talking to each other and going to march into the Winter Olympics together? I certainly didn't just a few weeks ago, and that again. So
I was going to stay with the climate change though, and that it's just I'm just very concerned that the world is going to go on without us, and technologies that we could be jumping on the bandwagon with, we're going to not have the opportunity to do those kinds of things. We're not going to be able to generate the jobs. And actually, I agree with the idea that we're not going to be able to get rid of coal in the near future. We're not going to be able to get rid of oil in the near future. The economics of that is just true. But then how do we deal with that? Do we cut ourselves off from the rest of the world and then try to just use our own resources? Do we participate in the international markets? It might be that under a renegotiated Paris Accord, we can't even participate in certain markets, and that's not good for us.
Well, I disagree with you completely. That is looking at it from a standpoint, first off, that doesn't comport with anything in history when it comes to this country. This country has been a leader from day one, and the other countries in the world, and we shouldn't apologize for that, the other countries in the world are absolutely going to be working with the United States because we all have to work together. This idea that I'm afraid we're not going to be at the table, we're always going to be. We've offered to be at the table, and we're still. They're going to be talking about this. I disagree. You and I have a completely different view. I have a very positive outlook on where we're headed, and I think it's good.
What have we done with the Paris Accords now since he left? What kind of negotiations have we done? We walked away from the table.
It's up to you.
We're not talking.
Okay, at this point, I'm going to go to two final questions. These will be directed to Congressman Emmer because it's our goal to wrap up at 6:15. This is another audience question. Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller is expected to interview President Trump soon in relation to Russian meddling in our previous presidential election and with regard to the president's firing of former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn and former FBI Director James Comey in an attempt to curtail or block the investigation. If the resulting investigation leads to an obstruction of justice charge against President Donald Trump as grounds for impeachment proceedings, will you support impeachment of the president as you had previously stated at the February 22nd, 2017 town hall meeting?
It doesn't matter who's in the office. If there is a violation, a criminal violation that has been proven, I think you always have to look at that. The same thing happened to President Clinton, for goodness sake. So, but this idea, first off, Liz, I don't know that there's any interview imminent with the President of the United States. In fact, this seems to be a concoction of the media. And you go to CNN, and it's Russia all the time. We know Russia is meddled in elections, not only here, but around the world. By the way, the United States has as well. The Obama administration was meddling in the Israeli elections. So let's say a lot of this made for primetime entertainment news is generating this, and until we see some actual facts of anything. And by the other thing is the president didn't fire Flynn, as I recall. I thought he resigned after he lied to not only Congress, but he lied to Pence, and then.
Comey was fired and Flynn was forced to resign.
There's an ongoing investigation, and the public information that's been released on the FBI bias. The president fired former Director Comey, and that's coming out as well. So there's a lot more to this that I think it'll be disclosed. Hopefully, Congress will get together and vote on releasing some of the intelligence that actually exists so the public can see what's really there.
A very tough question now, and this relates.
That one wasn't?
This one relates to St. John's and St. Thomas, so that is really tough. So this one goes to Congressman Emmer.
Wow.
You did not attend St. John's University or its rival, the University of St. Thomas.
This is true.
But you did graduate from St. Thomas Academy, where I know leadership principles, ethics, and good character are emphasized. On college campuses like this one, students are encouraged to engage in robust but civil debate. Are you troubled by some of President Trump's tweeting, name-calling, and insults? Would he be better off knocking that off, being more presidential, in which he focuses more on solutions and less on dividing people?
Well, we could say that about a lot of politicians, the last statement. Would we be better off not dividing people, all of us? What I would say is I don't agree with everything that anybody communicates. I had a radio show with a guy that he had his words, I have mine. They're going to have to live with whatever they do. In this situation, I am very troubled by our college campuses. A few years ago, I was actually offered a job at a college campus, and I was told that no one with as strident of views as mine should be on a college campus. Now, when did we start that? We can have legitimate disagreements, but we're supposed to have honest debate, honest discussion. And you know what? If somebody is so rude and if they cross the line of civility and all the rest, you know what we do in this country? We walk away. We walk away and we teach our kids that's not the way you behave. Midwesterners, we don't like this in-your-face, type of style of relationship. That's not who we are. But I'm not going to sit here and be the judge and jury for everybody's behavior, because I got to just take care of my own, and that's what I'm going to continue to do.
Another short question for Congressman Emmer. About 2 years ago,
I thought that was the last one.
Lucky you.
Moderator prerogative, what can I say? About 2 years ago, I interviewed Tina Smith here when she was lieutenant governor, and at that point, nobody knew that she would become a U.S. Senator. There was also an audience question here about parties working together. In my concluding question, do you anticipate there will be occasions where you will be working with the new U.S. Senator Tina Smith, and can you cite a couple of examples?
Well, I just had lunch with her last week, so we all got together. You probably, if you look, there's probably a picture out there of all of us. This happens all the time. You know, the problem is, and I think all of us, and not only the people that sit up here or people with election certificates, but everybody who's sitting out there, somehow, somewhere, we got to a place where we decided that our politics in this country was a zero-sum game. In other words, for one of us to win, one of us has to lose. That is not true. And the media does add to this thing, and we allow it, because we got politicians that use the media to drive this. We've got people who use the media to drive it, and the media does it because we all watch, all right? That's how they sell their advertising. The frustrating thing is we work together. Our leadership on both sides of the aisle right now is, look, we got President Trump not because of anything other than people are so frustrated with the inability of Congress to do what it has to do together that they just threw up their hands, and this is what you're going to get as a change agent. That's what you got. And what we are doing, what you're finding in Congress is people that are working in Congress do work together. They build relationships, and they're trying to get something done. The people at the top they're learning new lessons. They're finding out that America expects results, and they're on their way out. Not that they're bad people, but the way of leading 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, it doesn't work anymore. You got to start figuring out how we get to that place where I want the same things you want. Mm-hmm. I want good schools. I want good jobs. I want clean air. I want clean water. We just have different ways of getting there sometimes. How do we have a discussion so that we get to that place where we both can honor what we believe in and at the same time move things forward?
And that's why we invited you, because we want to have this conversation, and I'm glad you could do it.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it.
I'd like to personally thank Congressman Emmer and Professor Johnston for participating this evening. I'd like to thank everybody in the audience for attending. And just to let you know that if you would like to look at this discussion again, in a couple of days, the video will be posted on the McCarthy Center website. Thank you for coming and have a great evening.
Right. I'm just glad that you were